Okay, and then Gerd and Eric, do you have any preferences for how people raise questions? Do you want us to use the chat or just speak up?
I'd love it if people interrupted.
Cool.
Be awesome.
All right, take it away.
Okay, awesome. Thanks a ton, Andy. Let's see, I'm gonna share my screen here. Okay, can folks see the slides? Yes, and it's moving, okay. So, sorry, almost ready. All right, thanks for having us, Andy. I'm really excited about this forum, and I'm sad Emma's not here, but that was awesome. Geert, maybe you want to say a quick hey, just make sure people know who you are.
I'm Geert Dhondt. Eric will do the presentation.
Yeah, and hopefully we can get Geert back in at the end. So I encourage you to ask him questions. So today we'll present a working version of our study on prison labor, which we hope to put out in the next month or so, tentatively titled Prison Labor in U.S. State Prisons, 1974 to 2016, New Slavery or Enforced Idleness. And we make use of the survey of prison inmates posted by the Bureau of Justice Statistics. So we'll establish the theoretical context and our research questions. We'll introduce that data source, and we'll share our findings and assess their theoretical implications. And hopefully there can be discussion throughout and definitely discussion at the end. And there are slide numbers throughout, so feel free to take note of one if there's a slide you want to reference at any point. So there's, for theoretical context, there's a prevalent view in some academic discourse and in popular culture that understands mass incarceration as a new slavery, and specifically so as a racialized regime of labor exploitation, updated to meet the sensibilities of the modern era. And here we're discussing labor exploitation in the Marxian sense as the appropriation of surplus value from a worker for a profiteering market exchange. The new slavery view, it's one that posits that an important force in the construction of mass incarceration was the desire of corporations to generate profits by instrumentalizing racialized disposability in the US to amass a captive labor force in a network of prisons. So in our view, the specific claim of widespread carceral labor exploitation, as opposed to other forms of continuity with slavery, requires empirical evidence in at least three main categories. One is the scale, so how many prisoners work and for how many hours. Second is the content of the work, so what type of work are they doing and for whom. And third is compensation, so if or how much people are getting paid. And there's surely more to examine with regards to labor exploitation, but we consider these to be a sort of core three areas of inquiry into the topic. And in our paper, we'll look at the first two, the scale and the content. And just briefly, we set wages aside for the moment, just to sort of focus our attention on some of the less studied components of the topic, though we've done some preliminary wage analysis and would be happy to discuss their relevance later on. So here's our mini lit review. The scale and content of modern prison labor, and particularly the scale, are really notably understudied, which is, I think, especially surprising given how much has been made of the legality of forced prison labor in our assessments of mass incarceration. And as a result, it appears to us that many researchers who seek to reference these facts often end up making largely unsubstantiated claims that might further confuse the matter. And in what is perhaps a main example, many cite a state Department of Corrections or the Federal Bureau of Prisons policy that might include something to the effect of requiring all able-bodied prisoners to work, and then consequently assume an incarceration that is characterized by constant compulsory labor without attending to, first and foremost, the length of the work schedule that each assignment might carry, but also the portion of one sentence during which the requirement might apply, the types of prison programs that might count as work, and surely other qualifying considerations. And to briefly illustrate the cost of neglecting those questions, we can take the example of someone incarcerated in a New York prison who has 2 hours of aggression replacement training in the morning, which is what those programs are called in New York, and a 3-hour mess hall cleanup work assignment in the afternoon that actually takes 15 minutes because there are 20 people assigned to it, and then might exercise and watch TV in the evening. This is an able-bodied person who would meet the so-called universal prison work requirement by spending over the course of a week 10 hours in a prison therapy program, the merits of which are not the topic of this presentation, and an hour and 15 minutes doing manual labor. And while we will turn to weekly hours work data later in the presentation to examine how common a story this might be, I mean to present this framing here just to show how the question of scale of prison labor is often inadequately addressed. And here's some popular sources. Assertions of mass incarceration as mass labor exploitation are quite common. Just a couple examples, one from Michael Moore and one from Ava DuVernay's film 13th, the title of which is an important contribution to such a new slavery interpretation. So there are empirical claims on both of these slides about how many prisoners work and for how long, what type of work they do and for whom. And we mean to test these popular ideas in our study. So our study asks if mass incarceration is in fact the program of captive labor exploitation. And in order to ask that question, we break it down into 3 constituent questions that I think can be asked quite straightforwardly of the data. What type of work do prisoners do? How many prisoners work and for how many hours? And how does this change over the course of the prison boom? So this is the data we used. The SPI is the Bureau of Justice Statistics cross-sectional survey of prisoners in the US. It's meant to produce national representations in fields including demographic and socioeconomic characteristics, crime and sentencing history, drug and alcohol use, and then there's a tiny section at the end on how one's time is spent during incarceration, which is the section that we use. We only look at state prisoners here because it allows us to use all 7 surveys because federal prisoners weren't included until the 90s. And about 90% of prisoners are incarcerated in state prisons. So we consider this to be a useful national representation. We'll turn first to the type of prison labor, for which we've developed the analytical categories of prison upkeep and enterprise. And here's a little picture of the 1979 code book with the work assignment question and its sort of 10 type of work options, which we'll continue considering. So about these work categories, we seek to organize them primarily to consider the different economic contexts, like sources of demand, regulatory environments, et cetera, that determine the extent and content of the work assignments. So with this as our rubric, we use these 2 categories. Prison upkeep, which we define as the domestic reproduction of prisons and prisoners absent market exchange, and enterprise, which we define as state-run or private commodity production. And you can see on the slide how we map those categories onto the SPI options. Unfortunately, there isn't information from the survey on whether an enterprise job is done for a state-owned correctional industry or for a private corporation as part of the prison industry enhancement program, which is sad, but it's probably not the best type of information to gather in a survey anyway, but we combine it with some other data sources later on. We'll turn to in a minute. So back to the categories. While demand for enterprise labor derives from state agencies or private customers who are eligible to purchase prisoner-produced goods or services, prison upkeep labor is determined by the internal planning processes of state corrections departments for the day-to-day continuation of the institutions they govern. So in this sense, the prison is analogous to a household, and prison upkeep work is analogous to domestic labor in that it is of high utility and often not directly organized by a purchasing market. So by their definitions, these categories are mutually exclusive and together describe all prison labor. With regards to, you can see at the bottom, with regards to off-grounds work, we assume that any assignment done off the prison grounds is facilitated to some extent by a state-owned correctional industry coordinating work release or other assignments that involve non-DOC purchasers of prisoner products or labor. So these work assignments, as with the enterprise work assignments within the prison, involve a purchasing market and remain separate from the non-market, centrally planned DOC prison upkeep processes. So the categorization will yield some imperfections, but we think they'll be pretty rare. But you do sometimes encounter, for example, a prison farm to table program where prisoners farm and produce food for themselves, which for us would be coded as enterprise because we code all farming as enterprise, but that would actually be prison upkeep because it's domestic reproduction. And in going in the other direction, there are instances of a non-DOC agency like a school bringing items to a prison for repair, like worn auditorium chairs. This would be coded as prison upkeep because it would be under maintenance, but there's actually an exchange taking place, so it should be categorized as enterprise, but we think those will be anomalies for the most part. So on to our findings now. The y-axis here is the percentage of work assignments in either labor category out of the total number of work assignments at the time of each survey, which are given in their absolute terms in the blue numbers on top. Since the vast majority of prisoners have one work assignment, this is effectively a graph of which type of job each prisoner has. And I'll say quickly, if you were to instead plot with a unit of hours worked for each type of work, that would make the purple enterprise slice a little bit bigger, since enterprise jobs often carry slightly longer work schedules, but the difference is very small. So as you can see, the story here is that incarcerated workers primarily do prison upkeep labor. And this is a very steady fact throughout this period. On average, it's 76% of work assignments that are in prison upkeep, with a low of 72% in the first year and a high of 84 in 79. And we'll offer a broader scale of labor context for this graph shortly. But first, this graph doesn't show state versus private enterprise breakdown because it can't with the SBI data. So we'll take a quick look at that with some other data. This is the number of incarcerated workers in prison industry enhancement programs, which is to say this is all prisoners who do labor for private corporations since 2002, compiled from the NCIA, which is the official technical assistance provider for the PI program. Sadly, we don't have the earlier years yet, but we're working on it. There should be some interesting stuff there. But it consistently hovers around 5,000, which represents the tiniest fraction of incarcerated workers at 0.6%, and an even tinier one of all incarcerated people in general, which would be 0.4% for 2016. So the absence of private corporations among the factors that determine the contours of prison labor is, I think, quite shocking and demonstrated here. So now we'll turn to the scale of labor. So let's first focus on the blue job holding line, which shows the percentage of prisoners with a work assignment at the time of the survey, regardless of what that assignment is or how many hours per week they do it. And as a reminder, this is taking place during the prison boom. So you can note the absolute figures at the top. So the story here is that as a matter of percentage, job holding declines consistently from 78% in the mid 70s to 61% in 2016. And this is our absolute figures graph. And I think it's interesting to note that while declines in job holding are consistently so as a matter of percentage, they also become declines in absolute terms after 2004, which is a remarkable fact given the continually rising prison populations. So what job holding alone doesn't capture is how many hours per week each job is. So we'll turn to that now. At the bottom left, you can see how we construct an idleness measure, which includes anyone who doesn't work or who works up to 10 hours per week, which is likely to be up to 2 hours per day, which just allows us to combine job holding with weekly hours worked into one easy to glance at metric for considering the scale of labor. So this is the 1974 histogram, which is the earliest year for which we have data. And as you can see, a bit under a quarter don't have jobs, a bit over a quarter work full-time type schedules. And then there are a bunch with part-time type hours, and interestingly, a bunch with these weird intense work schedules up to 60 hours a week or higher. And I should say from some interviewing we've done, it sounds as though the type of scenario I described earlier, where someone might have a 3-hour work assignment that actually just takes 15 minutes, it could be quite common. So it's likely that the longer duration, the 3 hours, is what a respondent would record, but the actuality would be much lower. So now we'll compare this histogram to 2004's and see how things change. And the story here is that there's a clear leftward shift. So no or low hour jobs on the left side come to make up a larger percentage of all jobs in 2004 than they did 3 decades earlier. So with regards to our idleness measurement in 2004, in the first bar, it's a full third of prisoners who are jobless. The second and third bar show that it's 1 in 5 prisoners who work what is likely an hour or 2 each day. So together they sum to 54%, which is to say that the majority of prisoners in 2004 were idle, according to our definition. And this is just the absolute figures depiction, which I think is quite intuitive. Now we'll look at the histograms in a more consolidated version side by side. And I think sort of a couple minutes behind here. I wanted to leave 10 minutes, but we should be done pretty soon. This is how the distribution of work schedules changes over time. So joblessness is in blue. It increases. Up to 10 hours worked is in yellow. It increases steadily. The part-time-ish jobs are in purple, and they interestingly stay very consistent. And pink, which is full-time-ish, declines steadily. And then the special highlighted yellow bar at the end is the result of prediction using multiple linear regression analysis, because the 2016 iteration does not gather weekly hours worked data, but we think we can predict it somewhat reliably, and we'll talk about that in a bit. So we'll return to our overall percentages graph now, plotting idleness. So, and just to emphasize it again, the blue job holding line and the white idleness line are not mutually exclusive, because idleness, by our definition, contains people working very low hour jobs. So to emphasize it, idleness crosses the majority threshold by 2004. And then by 2016, according to our prediction, it rises to 64%. So 2/3 of incarcerated people idle. And we think this demonstrates that the construction of mass incarceration was the process of throwing more and more people into cages, not to labor, but to be idled with regards to formal work. And this has important implications for how we understand mass incarceration. For the 2016 idleness figure, we generated it from regressing idleness on job holding and type of work proportions, because enterprise jobs, as I mentioned before, tend to have slightly higher slightly longer work schedules than prison upkeep jobs. Mhm. And we've tested it against some other ways of making that prediction, and we feel quite confident in it. Happy to look under the hood of that regression a bit more later if people are interested. But we want to foreground the 2004 data, which is plenty informative and I think quite shocking, and 2016 is also quite interesting. So these are our absolute figures. So with some simple math, we can say that throughout the development of mass incarceration, out of every 10 additional people who were incarcerated, 4.2 ended up jobless in prison, 2.8 ended up working 10 hours a week or less, which is to say that 7 out of every 10 ended up idle by our definition, which emphasizes this point of what the process of the construction of mass incarceration really was. Okay, so some brief summary and then analysis. With regards to the scale of labor, during the prison boom, idleness surpassed work as the dominant characteristic of prisons with regards to prison labor. And for type of labor, throughout this period, the prison labor that does occur remains primarily devoted to the non-market domestic reproduction of the prison and prisoners. And for our analysis, we'll first begin with considering the prison labor that does occur, and then we'll zoom out to consider the implications for understanding mass incarceration more broadly. So first, is prison labor profiteering? Our answer is no, it is not. It's very infrequently done for private corporations. It's almost all, it's work done for the state, and it would be much better described as carceral workfare, or a set of work obligations to the state in exchange for the carceral welfare of room and board in conditions of non-solitary confinement. And we also think that prison labor is better understood to have a central purpose of contributing to the prison system of social control and discipline. Any labor economist would tell you that an efficient system of labor exploitation would look like the smallest number of workers working the highest number of hours possible, whereas the lower hour jobs spread out across as many prisoners as possible is more suitable for a system that doesn't aim to extract as much value as it can, but rather seeks to ensnare as many prisoners as possible in a centralized social order. And to return to the main research question with which we began, is mass incarceration a program of captive labor exploitation? Our answer is no. If the development of mass incarceration from the 70s to today was being driven by the excitement to exploit a captive labor force, we would see high percentages of additional prisoners put to work, driving levels of prison labor up. And we would expect the work prisoners do to be market-driven pursuits of profit, likely involving more commodity production and more private involvement. But instead, we see just the opposite, with decreasing levels of labor in prison, and the vast majority of prison labor simply dedicated to continuing the existence of the prison, which begs the question of what then prisons are for. And just to close,
oh, sorry, go for it.
Oh yeah, just our last sentence, I'm really excited to hear it. Just our last sentence is, the political economy of mass incarceration is not that of chattel slavery, and it's not that of convict leasing of Reconstruction, both of which are driven by a core imperative to labor exploitation, but rather it's a new and peculiar economic institution that appears as a network of warehouses for neoliberal capitalism's idled life. And that's where we'll leave it. Very interested to hear people's responses.
Hi, thank you for sharing this research. It's a very interesting topic, and these are new findings I've not seen before. So very cool to see these trends. I guess one of the things that struck me about your findings is, I think the somewhat, I guess the missingness of the economic impact of the funding of the prison systems themselves and who that benefits, right? And so I've heard many people conceive of prisons as basically a giant jobs and investment program for the white communities in which they tend to be located, where the people who live there get a lot of money from working there. They get a lot of state funding to house these people, right? And so simply having people warehoused generates economic benefits for specific people, right? And so to what extent are people in this prison industrial complex receiving state funds and other resources to provide these upkeep services that are actually being provided through prison labor, and then they're sort of pocketing that as sort of the the wages of doing this kind of stuff, right? So it sounds like prisoners themselves are doing a lot of this upkeep, and there's a huge amount of money going to this system, but not to these people, presumably, right? And so saying that it is not a system of exploitation, or there's not really, I think that economic impact is, I think, often what I think of first in terms of what prisons are doing. It is a transfer to these kinds of people who are exploiting this population, who they're able to actually, it sounds like have self-govern or sorry, like sort of self-reproduce in many ways, but then the resources that are set aside by the state to upkeep that population are going to different groups of people. So I wanted to see how that figures into your thinking. Another point that I wanted to raise is over this time period, thinking from 1976 to 2004, the composition of the prison population is probably changing pretty drastically in terms of what kind of person is getting arrested for what and being incarcerated for what. And so I was wondering how you would think of the change in the composition of the kind of person who is incarcerated feeding into the story about how work and expectations about work could be changing over time. Specifically, things that come to mind are like immigration detention, and knowing that work is something that I think happens more there, and is a part of the impetus for the growth that system has seen, and the sort of long-term warehousing of people before having their decisions to that going on. I'm thinking about the distribution between different security levels of prisons and how that could be changing over time as things like the war on drugs and other kinds of aspects of sort of how we police over this time period are changing, and how that could be sort of part of the story of what's going on here. Yeah, thanks.
Yeah, I have a bunch of thoughts. I just want to check in with Geert since I've been doing all the talking. Any thoughts, Geert?
Sure. A couple different points. I think the economic impact and the transfer of of wealth to a certain sense of the state funding certain kind of regions. I think that's well taken in a lot of months, but it's not about, it's beyond the scope of what we're doing here. And I think there has been some research about this in general as well. One particular point I think that's incorrect that you said within this statement that you made about that is about benefiting white people in rural areas where prisons are. I think that's only the case in certain states, especially in northern states. That is not the case in, say, Alabama, or and so on. I think it's very state specific, or region specific about who are the prison guards and who works in those places and so on. The second thing, immigration detention would not be included in these because these are state prisons only, so that's also different. And the security types, the security levels, right? These are surveys done by the Bureau of Justice Statistics, and they are trying to create, they say, a representative sample of prisoners. They interview about 10,000 or so prisoners, and they try to create a representative sample from different security levels, from different states and from different regions, and that's what and that's how they create that data set. So Eric, do you have any other thoughts?
Yeah, I do. Yeah, I think all those points are well taken and are important for this like broader holistic economic analysis of what mass incarceration is. I agree with Geert to a certain extent. I think the trend you described of using prisons as a sort of public investment project for rural communities devastated by like recent economic history, which is something that Mike Davis has called carceral Keynesianism, and Ruth Wilson Gilmore has also called it that, is I do think that that has played a role in the construction of mass incarceration. It's an important way in which local representatives have sort of gathered political currency by convincing their constituents that they can provide like economic revitalization through the prison fix. The prison fix has been demonstrated to be one that doesn't work. So when a prison arrives in like a new rural locality, it doesn't suddenly create thousands of jobs. It's often like corrections bureaucracies are so bureaucratic that it mostly just ends up in corrections workers being transferred from other prisons. And it also often leads to capital flight from those localities for, I think, sort of obvious reasons. The town can come to be seen as a prison town. So that myth is like alive and it's effective and it's very useful to certain politicians, but it is in fact a myth. So it's important with regards to understanding how mass incarceration became a thing. And I think it's also important to recognize that there isn't really that much of a transfer of funds going into rural communities through carceral Keynesianism.
Sorry, I just wanted to, I guess, maybe clarify what I was saying. I think that trend, I guess the main point that I was trying to make is that there are people who get paid to do this, right? And whether they're in rural communities, whether they're, in, majority Black states, it's majority Black people, it is not the prisoners, right? So it is other people who are being paid. And I think prison budgets have increased pretty substantially over this time period. And so the size of the transfer to somebody, whether they're in a rural community or not, or whether it's a prison town or not, that transfer is happening. And so I guess I just wanted to push back on the conception of doing prison upkeep as like not something that has prison labor as a source for profiteering. There's people being paid to do that. And if it's being done by people who are not being paid within prison, regardless of who those other people are, I think that's sort of the core of what I was trying to.
Yeah, that's awesome. And I'm sorry I was moving slowly. About to get there. I think this is so important. The main thing we're arguing is that there isn't private profiteering that's going on inside prisons. What is taking place, which you're pointing to, is still, it's still like a certain form of slavery, I would argue. It's like, it is horribly oppressive. It is extracting value. The prison upkeep work that prisoners do is still economic. And as you're pointing to, they're getting paid basically nothing to do something that would otherwise cost the state a ton of money. So that money's going somewhere. And with my preliminary wage analysis, I found that nationally, on average, state departments of corrections spend 1% of their budgets on prison labor wages. So, I think the question of what is the broader economic function of uncompensated prison labor is very, very important. And, I would hope that the next portion of this conversation is, what do these findings mean for resisting mass incarceration? And, I think it's, and I was talking with Andy about this the other day, it's interesting to wonder about what would happen if states were actually required to pay prevailing wages to incarcerated people for the work they do. Because it's 1% right now, but if instead of being paid 13 cents, you were paid a livable wage, it'd become 120% of state DOC budgets. So that point is well taken. I think that's very important. And I think it's helpful for me in terms of making sure, in terms of clarifying the point I'm trying to make here, which is more so about the relative absence of private corporations with regards to prison labor specifically. I think there is a prison industrial complex with regards to prisoners as consumers and prisoners as commodities, but not with regards to prisoners as laborers.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
So we are at time, but I'm happy to stay on for a few more minutes if folks have to go. Totally understandable. I wanted to ask two questions. One, I've been working with the SBI data too, and one thing that I've been curious about that I haven't had time to really look into, and I'm curious if y'all have had a chance, is just what is going on with, like, what are people who are working these 40 hours a week or more, sometimes up to 80 hours a week? What are they doing? What is the, are these prison upkeep jobs? Do we just have people who are, you know, really bearing the brunt of labor that goes into prison upkeep, or is it something else? I've also found, you know, some people who are making pretty like sometimes substantial wages. And so I'm curious, you know, what jobs are, I mean, of course, the majority, you know, most people are making very low wages, but for the minority who are making, you know, few dollars, like what we might, you know, you might consider a low wage job outside of prison, you know, what does that work entail? And then I'm curious what, you know, Eric, you and I have talked about this, but the dealing with the cross-sectional data, how do you make sense of the fact that we're just looking at a given week with these hours worked, and that although, you know, we have a picture where you just have like a you have a picture here of I think right here we have a substantial a small majority of people in prisons who are working, most of whom are working, you know, just a few hours a week. But then of course, you know, there might be people who are reporting no hours this week, but might be working the week before or the week after. So how are you, have you thought about like sort of how to account for that, and to try to get a better sense of any kind of measure of, you know, what percentage of the incarcerated population is working any hours in a given year, or like during their sentence or something like that?
Sorry, I was muted. All great questions. I think to move in order, your first question was about what are these like high hour jobs, right? And so I think the best I can do to answer these questions is just show what analysis I have done and not do much speculation. But so up on the screen, we have, this is a histogram for 2004 of prison upkeep jobs. And you can see how it compares to the histogram I'm going to switch to now, which is enterprise in 2004. So the point here is just the enterprise jobs have more of a centered distribution. So the higher hour jobs are likelier to be these enterprise jobs. And, you know, I don't think that's very surprising if, whether it's private or state, you know, if it's an actual corporation whose operations are governed by the imperative to, you know, produce value, they would want to have, you know, fewer people working higher hours, like we were discussing before. And also, if you have to, like, if it's off grounds, it might be the sort of thing where, you know, it's very laborious to move through all of the security protocols. So if you're gonna take someone outside of the prison to have them do a job, it should be for nine or 10 hours or something, and not a 2 hour, like that. You wouldn't get any bang for your buck. So I think that's the best I can do with that one. The high wages stuff, I don't know. I didn't analyze wages in that much detail yet. I did see there was some like $11.40, I think in 2004. And I can only speculate that that's for an enterprise job, and it's very likely that 80% of it was deducted for prison room and board, so to speak, which is common. Yeah.
One thing here with these high hours. So these are the surveys, but if you also look at all the state reports, so most states have various kinds of correctional industries reports. And so there it is usually only in their kind of correctional industries programs where you have people that work 40 hours a week or so, and it's a small number of people.
Yeah. And then was your second, I know the last question was about the problem of the survey only happening at one point in time. And what was the second question? Sorry, Andy.
I'm just curious, yeah, if you've thought about how to get a sense of, I mean, I think I think it's still worthwhile to consider, even though you have a lot of these jobs demanding only a small number of hours per week. What does it mean that it's perhaps a typical feature of a sentence to be required to work for nothing at some point while you're in prison? And that's perhaps a demeaning or dehumanizing experience. And I think it's worthwhile to ask how common that is. And so,
Yeah.
is it possible to get a sense of like what I don't know, have you looked into or thought about how to get a sense of how to use, or just how to get a sense of that, given the limitations of the cross-sectional data?
No, except just like, what we know about prisons anecdotally. And I think it's reasonable to think of this as, here was my thing, to think of this as like prison labor touches everyone who goes into prison. It just happens to be increasingly so for very small amounts of time. But I think that's part of like prison labor as social control, this thing. It's like part of, as I think you're suggesting, Andy, it's part of what the experience of incarceration is supposed to be, right? You're supposed to give back to society. You're supposed to not become a drain on the state by just like, benefiting from the prison room and board, right? You're supposed to work. It's part of your moral redemption. So I don't know. I think it's a very important question about like, is slavery still at the essence of incarceration, which I would suggest it is.
Can I jump in and say something about this real quick?
Yeah,
so the newest, I've talked to Eric and Geert about this. The newest 2016 data, first of all, just to say the data, just what's in it. And of course, we know all the problems with collecting data for the BJS. And this question certainly has problems also, extremely deep ones, but it asks why work is important to incarcerated people. And it gives, I don't have my own slides pulled up. Oh, I do have my own slides pulled up. Asks a series of questions, asks that people who have work assignments, incarcerated people who have work assignments, asks them, how important are work assignments to learn new job skills? How important are work assignments to earn spending money? How important are work assignments to break up boredom? How important are work assignments to try and get out of prison early? And how important are work assignments to make and spend time with friends? And even if we know that these questions are loaded because they assume a benefit from working in the prison for the people who are working, we can also look at all of the anecdotal and qualitative data that's out there that suggests that prison work is not purely punishment. It's used also as a carrot because it is so boring to be in prison. And this connects to the idleness thing, where idleness itself is used as a sort of tool to get people to want to do even the limited amount of work that they have. And it makes people want to do even more work than that, not because the work is fulfilling, not because the work is interesting, not because, they want to benefit the prison or whatever, but because the other option is to like sit in their cell and do nothing. And I think that that's one really important thing about this idleness conversation, is that like idleness is just the other side of working. When you're looking at it in this way, it's not free time. And I think this sort of addresses also what you were saying about like what the purpose of the work is, and I think a large part of it is to my own thesis is that it makes people in the prison feel attached to the prison itself by doing this reproductive work. They get attached to the work that they're doing, and it could act as a disciplining mechanism in and of itself, even if it's this tiny amount of work, and not sort of like brute force discipline, but coerced carrot discipline. This is my thoughts on it.
I love that. And I would also add wages to the pool of carrot discipline, right? Like wages are effectively zero, but they do exist in different tiers. You know, you can make 10 cents or you can make 20.5 cents. And I think in that sense, wages are also just this sort of tool of social control and a way of avoiding a sort of an even greater likeness to chattel slavery. So yeah, I think it's a very salient point. It also plays into this idea of how some people would say work inside prison isn't prison slavery because prisoners are opting into the work, right? And as you've just described, you can create the totalitarian DOC government can create a set of social conditions that will make prison labor far more preferable to the alternatives.
Eric, I just had a quick question about how much do you think about the increase in idleness over time as a mechanical consequence of the fact that like prison upkeep labor doesn't move one-to-one with more people in prisons? So like while there's a prison boom, some things might be set like amount of space in a given place. There's maybe more laundry with more people, but I was curious how you think about like the idleness being a consequence of there being like less work to do per person, and whether that's something that you can like decompose from this.
I think that is a primary explanation. And I just brought up this tiny table I threw together, which shows how much more quickly the number of state prisoners grows than the number of state prisons, which is, I think, a way of telling the story of overcrowding. And overcrowding is something that happens to prison environments and also prison labor regimes, as you're suggesting. So there are two ways of absorbing prisoners into the labor force. Or rather, there are two things that can happen to a new prisoner when there's only a certain stock of work to go around. They can either not work or people's work schedules can get shorter. And I mean, those are the two things that we see happening. So I think that the story is I think there are two stories. One is the overcrowding thing that you're pointing to. There's only a certain stock of jobs. And also, let me go back to, sorry, I have to scroll through all this stuff. It's quite silly. But you can see in the blue job holding line, it's like staying static from 2004 to 2016, which kind of just suggests that there's like a steady stock of jobs and the prison population is still rising, and just every new person who comes in like doesn't get a job. Or as Andy was suggesting before, you know, they're still trading around those jobs and doing a small number of hours, but the stock of jobs stays consistent. And then I think the second story, why there isn't more work in prisons, has to do with how unprofitable prison labor has proven to be for state-owned and private enterprise. And the story here is just that prison labor has been shown to be unprofitable because there's so much like corrections protocol and security bureaucracy that corporations have to go through, and there are, you know, slowdowns and lockdowns and work stoppages from prisoners who might not be super in love with the 13 cents an hour wage they're getting. And, you know, like prison factories often have like poor manufacturing equipment. So there are all of these structural reasons that prison labor isn't profitable for corporations, which is an interesting thing to think about. And I think it has a lot of explanatory power in terms of understanding. I mean, you know, all of this begs the question, like, why aren't there factories producing stuff for private corporations throughout American prisons? And I think so that story is an important one.
Can I jump in with one more thing real quick about that?
Yeah.
I think it's worth noting that the 1970s were like just prisons were riddled with strikes because more prisoners were working in sort of industrial jobs in prisons at that point, and there was just a massive wave of prison strike. Suggests that part of the reason that prison work went down is in reaction to these strikes, because you can't have an organized workforce in a prison. Like, it's unacceptable to capital and to the state. So I think that that's an important thing to think about when we're thinking about why there's not that much industrial prison work, like for-profit prison work, is because of the fact that and that is something that's super dangerous to the prison.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting to think about. It's something I've been thinking about lately, is how there's this threshold, right, for the people who run a prison. You want as many people working as possible, up to the point that they sort of get too close to the real levers of power in prison, right? Sorry, was someone saying something? I'm done with that point.
So I actually,
Andy, I think we're losing you.
Yeah, I'm having some difficulty on my end with my computer too. How about now? I think that I'm not sure if people can hear me, but I think that I'll have to call it now. I need to run to another meeting. But hopefully you can hear me. Thank you so much. Please, y'all, if you're interested, please come to our next session next Friday. Share the recording in case folks want to check out this work more. But really excited about this, and yeah, thanks everyone for coming to the session. See ya.